Thank you very much. Sophie Hasperslag from Conciliation Resources, a London-based peacebuilding organisation. Thank you, Emmanuel and Uli, for your presentations. Two questions. My first one is, I guess, similar to Andrew's question in the first panel, which is the situation in West Africa. I mean, there have been a lot of challenges over the years, and it's not something recent. So, what is it, in a way, about the global war on terror, or the change in the framing of some of these problems, whether it's the language, whether it's the approach? What has the impact of that been on the space for civil society, or for some of your work in the region? It would be great to get more on that. And my second question is linked to the recent listing of Boko Haram last week by the US government as a foreign terrorist organization. And in your opinion, is that a help or a hindrance to sustainable peace in Nigeria? Thank you.
And good morning. Gráinne O'Hara, Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. I found the analysis on Mali fascinating, and it's a rather damning picture that's been painted, but one I think that is tragically, representing the complexity. However, what I found a bit missing from the analysis was the whole humanitarian context, and the fact that, yes, of course, what has happened in Mali has had direct implications for the way states interact with Mali, because of principled views about only interacting with a legitimate state authority. But in fact, the humanitarian agencies, far from leaving Mali, have actually increased their presence in Mali. And the big difficulty for us, and this is something that we share with our civil society partners, is the whole question of access to northern Mali to meet the immediate humanitarian needs. And while I do appreciate that meeting emergency humanitarian needs is something which has to be done now in the minute, whereas what was talked about in the presentation has more to do with root causes and the longer term projective. I was a little bit concerned, I have to say, at the enthusiasm with which military intervention seemed to be suggested as the best way forward, because from previous experiences, including with Afghanistan, where we've had 10 years of military intervention, that's not necessarily going to be, I'm not saying it has to be ruled out as a factor, I'm just saying that alone it's not necessarily going to be the way forward.
Okay. We'll take one at the back, and then we'll allow the panelists to speak, and we'll move over to this side.
Thank you very much for these presentations. My name is Grace from Accord. My question really is about the ECOWAS region and the freedom of movement that the ECOWAS countries are able to enjoy in that region. And whilst it's positive because it promotes some space for interaction and all the other benefits of that, what does it mean for peace and security in terms of threats, and also in terms of the capacity or the ability to control or to contain violent extremism? And I don't know what your opinion would be on that, and what the trade-offs really are in terms of balancing the positives and the negatives. My other question really is about the suggestion. I think one of the suggestions in terms of the way to respond was the issue of rebuilding trust and the question about infrastructures for peace. But how do, practically speaking, how do you do this when there's an urgency for results? You look at the Nigerian case, for example, there's just an urgency, we want something now. But how do you actually do something now? And how do you realize, how do you propose, what kind of engagement would you propose that would practically work in this situation? And just my final comment is about, I think Emmanuel referred to this and said that elections are decisive moments. And sometimes I wonder in Africa whether they are decisive in the positive lens or are they decisive in the negative lens, because there are situations that also raise all our differences, and they also create a situation where we have a lot of threats. And the Ivory Coast example that you pointed out to, whilst it's very interesting to say that, well, we were able to take Gbagbo out, but he had 40-something% of support. And in that kind of democratic model where we encourage that the winner takes all, what do we do with narrow margins, where people win with narrow margins? Well, how do we deal with those kinds of problems? How do we ensure that we get the opportunity and steady transitions that we want when we go into elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll allow the panel to reply to that. Lots of questions there, and I know there's people waiting to ask more, so if you can be easily read. Una, do you want to go first? you.
Very quickly, let me start from the observation about, at least from the ECOWAS point of view, there might be a misinterpretation of military intervention. ECOWAS is not proposing to use military intervention to end the crisis in northern Mali. What ECOWAS is proposing to do is to prevent Bamako from falling completely into the hands of the Tuareg rebels, the Ansar Dine, with its affiliate now, Akim. And in order to do that, the priority is to engage. As a matter of fact, 3 days ago, the leader of Ansar Dine, which is much more extremist than the Tuareg rebels, met with the ECOWAS mediator in Ouagadougou. So the processes of dialogue have begun. But ECOWAS at the same time is saying that whilst we talk, we do not want you to continue to expand your space towards the south and take Bamako. And because the Malian government at this particular point in time is weak, it needs to be shored up to be able to have a clear message that the southern part of Mali will not fall into the hands of the space. So this is the purpose now for which ECOWAS is seeking a UN resolution to legitimize what it means for the ECOWAS standby force to engage in supporting Mali, and not necessarily to fight a war with the rebels. As a matter of fact, the priority is dialogue. I thought I should emphasize that. I totally agree with the analysis on the whole issue about elections. Are they decisive movements in terms of the positive or negative? The margin in Ghana in the last elections in 2008 was 40,000. But because there was an acceptance that the choice of the people, however narrow, should be respected, the economy of Ghana last year grew by 13.5%. But I totally agree that the current system of winner takes all does not help. But once we reform governance, in order to be able to ensure that the space for political participation must include those who lost the election, it should not be the excuse to ethnicize politics and refuse to hand over power. And that's what Gbagbo tried to do with the very strong support of his wife, Simeon. And the signal must be very clear that whereas there are weaknesses in the institution that need to be strengthened, you do not exploit that to your political advantage. And this is the key challenge. And let me add here that whereas these processes might be weak, the worst thing to happen is the other side of it, in which you refuse to respect the very principles of democracy that brought you into power in the first place. But Gbagbo is the one who was the greatest beneficiary of what it means for the region to rally around and ensure that he stays in power when he was overthrown in 2002 in an attempted coup d'etat. But he's the one who reneges and wants to perpetuate himself into that rule. And I think this needs to continue. These were two key highlights, and I thought, then the Boko Haram on the US terror list. Well, that's purely a United States perspective of how to see these issues. I think if you were to ask in West Africa, people want to see more than that. People want to see the United States with other countries playing the role of support to the regional body and to the African Union, more than just listing this group as a terrorist group, because that one is well known.
Yes, and I just wanted to echo on what Emmanuel said about having the UN Security Council resolution just to help. There's no enthusiasm in war. I mean, Mali, we don't want Mali to be the next Liberia or Sierra Leone or Cote d'Ivoire. No, that's not an option. But like he said, Mali needs that UN Security Council resolution in order for ECOWAS and the AU to justify assist them with whatever they need to save the territorial integrity of the country, because the military is very weak and they don't have anything to defend themselves. So the rebel groups are moving, they have already occupied the northern part of the country. Now they're making plans to move up. And so if we don't have that Security Council resolution, then God only knows what will happen. And if that happens, then it will have a ripple effect, because Mali shares border with Cote d'Ivoire, which is part of the Meno River region. So you have Guinea, you have Liberia, you have Sierra Leone, which are conflict and fragile and post-conflict countries, which will then fall back into, I mean, we cannot afford to go into that direction. So military is not that's not the first option at all. It's the last resort. And I also wanted to talk about the humanitarian needs in Mali. Yes, you're very right. I didn't explicitly touch on that in my presentation, but yes, that's happening. But like you said, where the need is, they don't have access to those regions, the northern regions of the country. And so, I mean, what do you do?
But arguably, sorry to speak over you, but arguably we will, the question of access is extremely delicate.
Yes.
And with the more and more that the situation in northern Mali is characterized as like global terrorism, everyone under the sun is there, the more difficult it's making for the UN and for UN partners to be able to engage in a dialogue about access, because it's closing the space. The characterization of northern Mali as, you know, completely out of control, and every terrorist group on the globe has now rushed to northern Mali. That kind of analysis actually closes the space for humanitarian access. It makes it more difficult for us. So it is a very sensitive and delicate territory in which, as we move forward, we need to look at what the implications of action in one sphere can have for another. That was merely the point I was making. And I'm not trying to convey it as black and white, like military is correct or not correct. I just wanted to flag some of the humanitarian concerns.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that now, or should we take another round of questions and you can come back on that at the same time? Do you want to say something immediately?
Yeah,
very quickly. Can you use this one? This one.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's a very interesting perspective. And the dilemma now is what we must do. Now, everybody feels that the situation is going to deteriorate. So the point you made about access is important. But the Boko Haram, which is destroying northern Nigeria, the elements of Boko Haram have linked up already with northern Mali. And so the anxiety in the region is that we cannot let this continue to spread. But at the same time, there's a dilemma about humanitarian assistance. And that is why maybe the attention needs to be focused on what clear alternatives do we need to have clearly on the ground. And I think this, yeah.